Thank you so much, Alfie. So first of all, I would like to thank Karina Chiniski and Alfie Garcia so much for inviting me to participate in this event. Karina has been amazingly well organized and kind throughout this entire process. And Alfie, as he mentioned, I've known for quite some time as he once was a student of mine at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And what a pleasure it is to work with him again. I'm so impressed with what the two of you have put together. So thank you so much to the both of you for inviting me to talk this evening. I also want to acknowledge many wonderful people who are here from different phases in my life. My college roommate is here, and people I came to know in graduate school, as well as friends from UHM and UH West Oahu. Also here are colleagues that I've gotten to know at various conferences and through various programs, through Brandeis, Hillel, Hadassah, and AEN. There are people here from places as far-flung as Nederland, the Netherlands, and the Czech Republic. It is a particular pleasure for any teacher to see one's students attend events that they are not required to attend. And I am so happy to see former students, undergraduate and graduate students from the University of Hawaii at Manoa this evening. I see members of the local Jewish community here, and I want to thank them for their presence and their support. Finally, of course, my deepest thanks go to Marla Eglash and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the American Library Association for making this exhibit possible. So again, thank you so much. It's an honor to share this work and my story with you. A bit of an introduction to my approach and methodology. I want to acknowledge that I'm not a political scientist and not a historian. My areas in rhetoric and nonfiction, so memoir, biography, autobiography. My approach in this presentation is to combine personal narrative with the rhetorical analysis of a few examples of memoirs, accompanied by a bit of amateurish historical research. Second, I want to acknowledge that the version of the survivor of the Shoah that you will be introduced to is perhaps not the one you're accustomed to hearing about. There are many different kinds of Holocaust stories, and certainly I, along with countless others, have been inspired by those who were able to forge lives of compassion and generosity and truly impressive contributions to their communities. The stories I examined, however, are stories of those who did not contend well with the trauma associated with the Shoah, as it was often unprocessed and untreated. Here you will encounter a different sort of survivor, not a hero, not more moral, not more courageous, not more deserving to live, certainly, but traumatized and suffering and struggling with the past. The memoirs that I studied describe the effects of that suffering on subsequent generations. Third, due to time constraints, I have decided to limit this particular discussion to memoirs written by second-generation survivors, as opposed to those written by the third generation, or perhaps now even the fourth. And I focus primarily on those written by women, as I identify with them the most, for reasons that will become more clear by the end of this talk. Fourth, while the Holocaust did not occur on American soil, which means that Americans and American Jews of necessity experienced and thus viewed the Holocaust differently from those of us who have connections to the Holocaust in Europe and elsewhere, I want to acknowledge that an important part of the healing process for me has been the friendships I have made in the American Jewish community and with Jewish scholars here and abroad. And that is then maspeak chinuch, enough. At the end, we'll open this up for your questions, and please send them to me via direct message on the chat. What is inherited trauma and what does it look like? Well, I'll begin with a story that I like to tell because it takes place here in Honolulu and occurred relatively recently. Not long ago, I went to my mother's condo. She lives just 5 minutes from me, with a sun hat for her to repair. Its brim was no longer holding up, and I assumed she would know how to fix it. As I lay my hat down on my mother's kitchen table, she looked off as if she were somewhere else. Her attention was not on me, and she did not respond. For so long, my mom had refused to quote unquote ruin my childhood with stories of suffering from her past. But this time she spoke about two women she grew up with, a mother and a daughter who had survived the death camps. To make ends meet, they made hats. But one day the daughter saw one of their hats being placed on a mannequin, and something about that mannequin reminded her of the camps, the decapitated bodies, the heads separated from the corpses, somehow brought back images of the camps, things that she had seen. She began screaming in terror, had a kind of psychic break, and had to be driven then immediately to what was then the nearest mental institution, which was a few hours away. The entire drive there, her mother had to restrain her to keep her daughter from flinging herself from the car, trying to commit suicide. And so that is an example of how the trauma of the Shoah can interrupt a seemingly calm and innocent and happy day. This presentation examines the rhetorical and healing power of memoirs found in second-generation survivors of the Shoah, from my perspective as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. I argue that the rhetorical function of these memoirs includes both the expression of personal accounts of healing from inherited trauma and necessary public acts of resistance and documentation that serve to counter and undermine contemporary expressions of anti-Semitism and white nationalism, as well as to confront an increasing lack of awareness of the basic facts of the Shoah. More specifically, I draw on my family history, as well as the memoirs of two second-generation Holocaust survivors in particular, by amateur writers and historians Regina Rock and Eleanor Sontag, to argue that these first-person accounts of inherited trauma represent rhetorical acts of resistance and demonstrate the persuasive and healing power of breaking the silence. Breaking the silence might not seem much of a rhetorical contribution to those who have not experienced mass historical trauma, but to its victims, it can be terrifying and psychologically destabilizing to confront what has been deeply buried. Influential Holocaust historian Saul Friedlander sheds light on the difficulty of this task by acknowledging what he terms deep memory, which he defines as essentially inarticulable and unrepresentable, and as connected to unresolved trauma just beyond the reach of meaning, and as such cannot be passed on to later generations. Friedlander describes how any attempt at building a coherent self founders on the intractable return of the repressed and recurring deep memory. Scholar of English and Judaic Studies James Young, in citing Friedlander, explains further, that is, to some extent, every common memory of the Holocaust is haunted by that which it necessarily leaves unstated, its coherence a necessary but ultimately misleading evasion. I would suggest that if trauma is intergenerational, so is memorializing and meaning making. Thus, each generation must contend with the facts of mass historical trauma and then, on its own terms, reconsider its potential meanings for their lives, both personal and political. What happens, though, when those facts are not well known or under dispute? There is a dangerous and re-traumatizing dimension to contemporary public discourse regarding historical mass trauma, such as the Holocaust. Public conversations that invite or allow a questioning of whether the trauma occurred at all. Unfortunately, those who have played this role have often served in positions of authority and have used their rhetorical power to mislead their publics. Familiar examples from recent American public discourse include a recent school board's decision to ban mouse, and Whoopi Goldberg describing the Holocaust as not about race, since it involved, quote unquote, two groups of white people. As another example, an American high school principal, when questioned about his school's curricular materials on the Holocaust, implied in his response that whether or not the Holocaust occurred was a question about which reasonable people could disagree. Among the many reasons that I consider this fact-free dimension of contemporary public conversation not only unethical but dangerous is that the first step toward healing for victims of trauma is to have the reality of their trauma acknowledged and recognized. They crave outside confirmation that their memories of trauma are accurate and true. The recent rise of white supremacism and anti-Semitism, both in Western Europe and the United States, has made teaching and examining the Shoah relevant for this generation's students, citizens, and scholars. Although knowledge of the Holocaust within the US and Western Europe is assumed to be widespread, a recent poll of British citizens indicated that 5% of the British population claims that the Holocaust did not happen. 8% believes the scale of the genocide to be exaggerated. Close to 50% admitted they were not aware of how many Jewish people were murdered in the Holocaust, and 20% stated the number was less than 2 million. The lack of knowledge on the continent has been found to be even worse. In a similar poll, it was discovered that 1 in 3 people knew little or nothing about the Holocaust. An average of 5% said they'd never heard of it. In France, 20% of those aged 18 to 34 said they had never heard of the Holocaust. In Austria, the figure was 12%. A 2018 survey performed in the US found that 9% of millennials said they had not heard or did not think they had heard of the Holocaust. For victims to narrate the stories of their trauma can be in and of itself re-traumatizing. To have the veracity of their stories of trauma publicly questioned can be silencing, infuriating, and crazy-making. Thus, while there is a significant rhetorical role for memoirs of historical mass trauma to play in confronting contemporary ignorance, as well as the increasing presence of conspiracy theory within mainstream public discourse, it is important to keep in mind that researching, writing, recalling, and narrating stories of trauma can serve to re-traumatize so that a sense of time is lost. What happened in the past seems to happen in the present, and memories feel like moments experienced in the present tense. Not surprisingly then, the need for public acts of resistance by providing such testimony runs counter to a tradition of silence that many first-generation survivors of the Shoah chose. In the second-generation memoirs I study, 2 major themes emerge that resonate strongly with my own personal experience. First-generation silence about their experience in the Shoah, and narratives of resistance written by victims of inherited trauma experienced by the second generation. Silence on the part of their parents, rather than storytelling or witnessing, is a recurring motif in the memoirs of second-generation survivors, and as such often serves as a complication, as many survivors hid their experiences during the Holocaust from their children. An overwhelmingly common experience of second-generation survivors, documented by memoirists, is that the Holocaust was not talked about by their parents, and certainly not in front of the children. Thus, the act of writing a memoir is the ultimate betrayal of that unspoken agreement. These are things we do not talk about, and certainly not publicly among strangers. Writer Lior Saltzman gives voice to this common experience. He states, "When my parents were growing up, the Shoah was cloaked in silence. We struggled to piece together the story of my grandparents' escape from crumbs of stories left here and there. All we knew were black and white pictures of those who died, names and camps of grief. Whenever I talk to children and grandchildren of survivors, we end up bonding over the mutual black holes of memory." Indeed, for some second-generation writers, their family connection to the Shoah was buried so deep that the first shock they have to adjust to is that they are Jewish. This is because to many survivors of the Shoah, a reasonable response was to keep one's Jewish ancestry a secret from the new generation, so that they could live a life without fear of death and persecution. This has given rise to a subset of second-generation memoirists who were raised as Catholics, Christians, discovering later in life their Jewish roots and history. Regardless of how much information second-generation memoirists have when they begin their research into their family histories, all face a common struggle: how to bear witness to something they did not directly experience themselves. Jung addresses precisely this dilemma when he extends Friedlander's understanding of deep memory by laying out the difficulty it creates for memoirists of later generations, attempting to tell the story of first-generation survivors. The question remains, Friedland argues, whether at the collective level, an event such as the Shoah may, after all the survivors have disappeared, leave traces of deep memory beyond individual recall, which will defy any attempts to give it meaning. Jung explains, the implication is that beyond the second generation's artistic and literary representations of it, such deep memory will be lost to history altogether. Jung makes these comments when analyzing second-generation Holocaust memoirist Art Spiegelman's work in Maus 1 and 2, but the interpretive argument he makes is relevant to all memoirists working on the Shoah who are not first generation. Some of what the first generation experienced may have been so traumatic that they themselves have buried it so deeply as to be inaccessible to themselves as well as to others, as a form of psychic self-protection. How then can their descendants hope to know and understand, let alone portray, what the first generation could not bear to recall? Keeping this dynamic in mind, in reading and analyzing these memoirs, I looked for the ways these family historians contended with the silence of the first generation, the impossibility of conveying what was never revealed to them, experiences buried in deep memory, attempts to heal, and claims to Jewish identity that functioned as resistance to historical and contemporary anti-Semitism. I was not looking for or expecting aesthetic value or literary merit. And in fact, many of the memoirs I have read are self-published and do not bear the markers of literary polish or style. This does not bother me as I approach the memoirs as artifacts that can give me insight into the experience of the quote unquote average second generation Holocaust survivor who is not a professional memoirist or historian. Despite, or perhaps in reaction to, the first generation's tendency towards silence, the children of survivors are investigating their family histories, motivated by desires for healing and recovery, by curiosity about their family's hidden past, and by a sense of obligation to offer testimony to suffering and oppression when their parents could not. They tread on previously forbidden terrain. Some attend special conferences that teach them the art of historical sleuthing. Some find publishers for their eventual narratives they reconstruct. Many self-publish. In their memoirs, these writers break with an inherited tradition of silence to reclaim the experiences that many of their parents chose to leave behind and never speak of again. As the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, I identify with these authors and find in their writing helpful discussions of how silence, rather than telling the story of survival, was often the rhetorical strategy for survivors, a legacy these memoirs choose in their writing to revise. Prior to analyzing the two self-published second-generation memoirs, I shall briefly describe my journey of discovering and researching my own family's Holocaust narrative. My family story, the maid versus the chief rabbi of Amsterdam. Most of my family members on both my mother's and my father's side did not survive the Shoah. My father's immediate family escaped: my grandfather Mark, my grandmother Sophie, my aunt Raisy, my uncle Herbie, and my father Edgar. I have hesitated to tell the story of my father's escape from the Nazi invasion of the Netherlands for many reasons. First, these still feel like his rather than my stories to tell. Second, there are many gaps in the unofficial versions told to me in bits and pieces that one cannot consider them even close to historically accurate representations. Nevertheless, in order to provide some context for my work, I will offer a short version of what was eventually passed on to me, however flawed and incomplete. My father's immediate family left Germany in the 1920s for Holland, where they hoped it would be safer for them, and where my father was born in 1928. In 1939, they escaped Holland, leaving shortly before the Nazis' arrival. My brother recently interviewed my father about this time. Finally, in his late 80s, my father was willing to talk about his experiences growing up in Holland leading up to the war, after being silent about them for most of his life. He described being warned about the Nazi invasion of the Netherlands by their family maid.
Your maid was German? Tell us that story.
She was going to a Nazi meeting because all German citizens had to go to Nazi meetings. She came back one night and she said they're invading or invade Holland, and you'll have trouble if they do.
She had heard that they were going to invade Holland, and she told your father this.
So my mother that.
And your mother believed her.
Sure, why not?
Well, no one else thought Germany was going. Very few people thought Germany was going to invade Holland.
Very few people had maids that went to Nazi meetings.
So did she save your life?
I guess so.
If you could say something to her, what would you say to her?
Thanks for saving my life.
And your family. And your family.
My family.
Note that my brother attempts to impose a meaning on this significant family event: survival and gratitude to what we call the enemy who befriended them. I believe this is in keeping with my brother's desire for a message of a reconciliation and hope in the face of trauma. My guess is that this represents an attempt to bring about healing for himself, my father, and his children. Whether the maid was actually German, however, is disputed by my cousin, Michael Fish, whose version of this story is that the maid hailed from Czechoslovakia and went back there to cast her vote rather than from Germany to Germany. And so his version is as follows. Our grandfather had a housekeeper in Holland who was Czechoslovakian and returned to her country to vote after the Germans had invaded. While she was voting, the German officer bragged to her that the Nazis were going to invade Holland. She returned to warn our grandparents. Our grandfather believed her and tried to warn the friends who thought he was an alarmist. He bought tickets for the family to leave on the first boat out of Holland to England. When it came time to leave, he had not completed his business arrangements and told the family to leave without him. Sophie, our grandmother, refused and said they would all wait. He gave in. That first boat left and was torpedoed by German submarines and was sunk. They left on the next boat that was protected by destroyers. They made it to England and then left Canada. They all left then. Our grandfather established a crystal import-export business in Montreal and lost his investment because he made deals based on a handshake to which he was accustomed in Holland. And I'll just add a side note here that a scholar of the Jewish experience in Czechoslovakia has told me that she doubts that a citizen at the time would return to Czechoslovakia, least of all to vote, which provides a good example of how these stories that have been passed down can contain historical inaccuracies. In addition, the emphasis of this version of our family story is different, highlighting the betrayal at the hands of the Canadian businessmen my grandfather had trusted, and bet his fortunes on. The point of this version seems to be the extreme social injustices suffered by my family, accompanied by an undertone of mild awe and filial pride that our parents and grandparents triumphed over such a series of traumatic and unjust and unwarranted events. If there's any meaning given to this survival, I think it is alluded to in the emphasis that is placed on the false accusation of our family being quote unquote alarmist. The meaning given to this narrative then is that my cousin and I are here today because our grandparents were willing to believe the worst about human nature, experienced much of it, and lived to tell the tale. My grandparents were willing to consider the worst possible scenario as likely and then acted upon what were at the time considered to be paranoia and unnecessary fear. For my cousin, this is our legacy, not the message of reconciliation with one's enemies and hope for the future that my brother's interview questions hint at, but instead a stubborn pride and dark faith that when it comes to survival, believing human beings are capable of unspeakable evil is of much greater value than naively hoping for the best. My brother, in contrast, tells this part of the story this way.
Did your mother try to get some of her friends or relatives to leave?
I don't think anybody believes us.
Nobody believed it. They all thought German would not invade Holland. I heard a story that even your rabbi questioned why you were leaving.
It's true. The chief rabbi
Chief rabbi of Amsterdam,
of Holland.
of Holland. He said it was a bad idea to leave?
Yeah.
An irony that my family holds up deep within all of our consciousnesses is that the chief rabbi, who did not believe my grandparents, did not survive the war. My family survived by ignoring the supposed wisdom of the Jewish authorities and by listening to an enemy in their employ, according to my brother's version. It is interesting that in my father's telling of the arrival in Canada, the betrayal at the hands of the businessmen in Montreal does not come up. In my cousin Michael's family, this story is part of well-known family lore, but in my immediate family, my parents never spoke of it. My father did not enjoy the role of victim. And when he was raising my brother and me, he kept all stories that smacked of our family being taken advantage of, including being chased from Holland by the Nazis in the first place, from us. He wanted my brother and me to claim our rights as American citizens. He had by then emigrated to the United States, to be unapologetic and to be unafraid, to be nobody's victim. This is my father's version of their voyage to Canada.
Waited for weeks for a convoy ship to go to Canada. And he went to Canada. It took us about 2 weeks or more
To get there.
to get there, because we went a long way to avoid the U-boats. Because Canadian vessels are going to be sunk because they were part of the British Empire. Some got sunk. One of our sister ships got sunk.
Really? On that voyage?
No, previous voyage. So I remember my father being very scared. He used to pace up and down
The deck?
the cabin at night. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't understand what he was afraid of. I thought the whole thing was a big joke. We're going to go to Canada and now be Canadian Mountie, get a kid. And I was very excited.
You liked the idea?
Yeah, and all my friends were very excited with me.
Wow.
And this is how my father ends his Holocaust story, in the spirit in which he raised me. Even the Shoah is a grand adventure if seen in the proper light. We are heroes of our own stories, and fear, doubt, and distrust will only hold us back. In telling the story, I hope I've begun to shed a bit of light on how complex a process it is, the writing of a second-generation Holocaust memoir. Beyond the obvious complications associated with checking on the historical accuracy of family lore, there is also a multitude of competing and ever-evolving assigning of meaning attached to these stories of loss and survival. To address these tensions, I'll next place my family story within some historical context, and then return to the problems of inherited trauma and assigning meaning to suffering later in this presentation. Similar to many of the second-generation memoirs I read, I have embarked on a bit of historical sleuthing to place my family's admittedly imperfect rendering within the context of more established historical research. I learned that the Dutch Jewish community my father was born into was a lively, thriving one. Social historian Carol Lessing describes what my father likely experienced. The Jewish quarter in Amsterdam was a self-contained community within the big city. It was a busy community where the inhabitants lived in small and crowded apartments. There were many little stores, markets, stalls, and carts where merchants sold clothing, housewares, and food. The quarter had its own Jewish schools and wedding halls. It was a much alive but poor community with hustle and bustle all day long. On Friday nights, just before the Sabbath, all activity stopped and peace and calm came over the community. When my father now occasionally alludes to this time in his life, it seems to me that it was one of his happiest. It appears that he felt secure and safe attending Jewish institutions, schools, clubs, even swimming lessons for Jewish children. However, what might at first glance seem like a fairly typical example of nostalgia, in my father's case, is heightened and complicated by the harsh reality that the world my father fondly recalled was not only distant in time and place, but had been completely obliterated by the Nazis. As Lessing describes, most Holocaust survivors grew up in Jewish communities with a rich cultural spirituality and communal structure. It was there that they developed their sense of belonging, security, and identification. It was there that their families had established deep roots. It was there that the Holocaust survivor had gone to school, developed friendships, celebrated holidays and family events, listened to family stories, and from very young had participated in communal life. It was there that they learned the values of life. This was the world that my father was forced to leave under the threat of death at age 10. At the time of my family's escape, Holland's Jewish community was organized by the Joodse Raad, the Jewish Council, which worked with the Nazis to register Jews, send them to work camp in Westerbork, and for many, eventually to their deaths in Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, and other death camps. Although not everyone knew at the time precisely where the Jews ended up. This coordination with the Nazis was called aanpassing, roughly translated as adjustment, and immediately after the war was condemned as just short of collaboration. 104,000 Jews did not survive the Nazi invasion of the Netherlands, effectively wiping out the Dutch Jewish population. This high number is partially attributed to the efficiency of the deportations to Westerbork, in which the Joodse Raad is seen as having participated. The chief rabbi mentioned by my father in the interview with my brother, the one who asked my father's family not to create panic, Lodewijk Sarlui, was a member of the Rat. He was eventually sent to Auschwitz and died there. Had he listened to my father's maid, he might have escaped with them and survived. What is difficult to discuss and what we kept secret for many years is that there was a dark side to the story of escape and survival and the success and assimilation my father had planned for his children. At home, my mother, my brother, and I were victims of severe domestic abuse, sending my mother at one point to the hospital. My father indulged in affairs and violent rages. Later in my 20s, I went to a counselor for depression and anxiety and finally spilled the family secrets. The counselor wondered if my father were an alcoholic. I told her there was never any alcohol involved. She then labeled him a rageaholic. Never did she ask if my father were a Holocaust survivor. My being Jewish did not come up. It would have taken a therapist who was aware of the particular trauma suffered by second-generation Holocaust survivors for me to have had the opportunity to make the connection between my personal struggles and the collective historical trauma associated with the Holocaust. Instead, it took me almost 30 years to make this connection, which happened while I embarked on this research. Lessing writes, children of survivors often have the same symptoms as their parents who lived through the Holocaust. Many of them suffer from chronic depression and chronic anxiety and have serious problems with separation and individuation. Holocaust survivors and the children come for treatment with problems of depression and anxiety, as well as marital and relationship problems that on the surface seem typical of modern life. Unless we take an extensive history and are knowledgeable about the Holocaust, we may easily overlook some of the most poignant psychological and sociological long-term effects of their Holocaust trauma and the transmission of these effects to their children. Treating survivors and their children is a difficult task. I believe now that my father suffered from undiagnosed and untreated trauma related to the Shoah. He was only 10 when he had to leave his family, his school, his friends, everything that he was familiar with, because he was Jewish. And I believe this left him with emotional scars regarding his Jewish identity that he had not recovered from when he raised me. While some of my father's focus on the future can be explained as the typical emphasis of the immigrant on assimilation and hard work that hopefully leads to success and perhaps eventual acceptance, I think that this does not tell the whole story. Lessing confirms this suspicion, citing Jerusalem psychologist Dina Wardy. Most of the Holocaust survivors emigrated and started new lives in new countries, devoid of memorabilia and feelings of belonging to a family, a community, or country. Despite the monumental losses and suffering, the survivors focused on the future. They could not look back. The grief of all of their dead relatives, their lost homes, their lost communities was too much to bear and would have paralyzed them. The knowledge that they would never return to their birthplace, that their houses and communities had been destroyed, was no less harsh a blow than the loss of their families. Only psychic emptiness could continue to protect them from being flooded with feelings of loneliness that threatened their very existence. Many Holocaust survivors thus, according to Wardy, perceived silence about their losses and trauma as necessary for psychological survival. They preferred psychic emptiness to the feelings of grief and loss they feared might overwhelm and incapacitate them. Breaking that silence, however, seems to be key to the psychological health of their children, according to the memoirs I analyzed and in my own experience. You don't complain about escaping the Holocaust. Although all whose lives were affected by the Holocaust are now considered to be quote unquote survivors, in my family, we considered only those who were sent to the concentration camps and lived survivors. To this day, my parents refuse that title. Although my father and my mother's family members had to give up their homes, possessions, friends, family members, native languages and customs, they consider themselves extremely fortunate. It was in my family and in many of the family memoirs I read unheard of to complain of having escaped the Holocaust when so many deserving people didn't. Eleanor Sontag describes this perspective in her second generation memoir. I questioned whether my parents were survivors, My parents had never been in concentration camps. They had escaped Germany in 1939 and considered themselves refugees. I thought to myself that my parents had not suffered the way the parents of these children had, because they had never endured the stresses and humiliations of a concentration camp. I even thought it was presumptuous to think of my parents as survivors. Over the years, though, I've come to realize that the details of what happened during that period did not matter so much as the fact that all of the Jews who were persecuted shared a bond that made them a separate and special group. They all outlived Hitler's Germany, and each experienced their own profound feelings of deception, displacement, and loss. Thus, Sontag eventually sees the common losses shared by Jews affected by the Shoah as more significant than their differences. One of the key shared experiences being whatever cultural, personal, financial, psychological losses escapees of the Holocaust may have experienced. At the time, they went largely unrecognized and unacknowledged. Another notable silence the Memoirs describes relates to the loss of the home, culture, and language. Frequently, the survivors are portrayed as ambivalent about their native culture and language, even as there is some longing on the parents' part for their former lives. German, for example, was often not taught to the survivors' children, although the parents were often either fluent or conversant in it. During my childhood, my mother was notably accepting and respectful of any identity other than what she referred to as the goddamn Germans. And she refused to purchase anything made there, including cars manufactured by Volkswagen and Mercedes. Similarly, in the Memoirs, Germany or Hitler are rarely spoken of by the survivors, but when they are, they're often alluded to with a special derogatory term, well known within the family, but never used outside of the home. Nevertheless, if they have feelings of being connected to a home, a sense of place and family, this is often rooted in childhood memories of countries where they eventually were banished from. Thus, entire nostalgic histories and important family memories are shrouded in silence due to this ambivalence. As Kara Lessing describes, between 1933 and 1945, the Nazis not only killed 6 million Jews, but they also systematically destroyed all the Jewish communities of Europe. The flourishing Jewish communities of Warsaw, Riga, Salonika, and Amsterdam, just to mention a few, were destroyed, and hundreds of small communities vanished. Those who survived the Holocaust lost not only their families and their homes, but also their social and family traditions, their communities. The survivors suffered a complete break with their pre-Holocaust lives. And with that, they lost their basic sense of security, belonging, and identity that their communities had provided. Davidson believes that such collective social trauma interacts with that of trauma individually born, thus making the combination of the two more harmful, stating that survivors of social catastrophes suffer from a collective trauma in addition to the individual trauma. When a community is destroyed, there occurs a psychic impairment that enhances the individual trauma process and makes the effect of that individual trauma more difficult. A result of this complete break and resulting lingering ambivalence and silence is that the story of the Holocaust becomes a burden and a secret for the second generation to recover from and perhaps to tell. The trauma, however silenced, is nevertheless inherited, and the sense of isolation and otherness that was no doubt experienced by the Holocaust immigrant survivors is often in some form passed on to the children. The memoirs I analyzed describe not feeling as though they entirely fit into their American surroundings. Their homes are more formal and European than their neighbors. Their parents, although quite often patriotic and loyal to their new country, cut their pizza with a knife and fork, have a sense of style and fashion that is dated. Their discipline is more strict. Their homes are more somber. In addition, both the survivors and their children discover that talking about the Holocaust with their American neighbors can make those neighbors uncomfortable, so they learn not to bring it up. The topic retreats further into forbidden territory and becomes taboo. This felt sense of difference and isolation fostered by the injunction to not speak about the Holocaust is compounded by the painful realities of the survivor's story. Many had to leave mothers, fathers, uncles, aunts, sisters, brothers, cousins behind. The few who did survive were often scattered across large distances, some arriving in the US, others in Canada, England, Australia, Mexico, or Southern America. Thus, when I was a child, the concept of extended family was largely foreign to me, and the idea of a family reunion, that most American of traditions, with its attending images of people of all ages in matching t-shirts filling up the screen, felt as unreal to me as some of the American traditions my parents worked hard to adapt to, having never experienced themselves in their homes themselves. Thanksgiving, Sunday football, the 4th of July. It is impossible for many of my American friends to imagine the guilt and shame that accompanied the concept of extended family in my home. But the memoirs write of how their parents chose not to speak of the family members they had left behind. Second generation memoirs often describe themselves as having a deep sense of loss, not growing up with or even knowing the basic histories of their extended family members. It is extraordinary for children of survivors to have had grandparents. Children of survivors also lack the continuity of their family's communal and cultural history. Many grew up without ever hearing family stories or seeing photographs of their parents' or grandparents' childhood. Even when they travel to their parents' birthplace, they find a destroyed community with remnants of gravestones in the Jewish cemeteries. The discontinuity of their family's communal and cultural heritage is ever present, as is the loss of their grandparents, uncles, aunts, and cousins. The result is that some second generation survivors feel the need to fill in the gaps of their knowledge left by this pervasive silence and become their family's amateur historians and storytellers. Rock and Sontag perform these roles, embarking on extensive historical research, locating lost family members, and discovering how, where, and why these quote unquote vanished family members died in concentration camps, tracing their lost family members through ghettos, transports, and ultimately to their deaths. Unfortunately, the glaring disparity between the second generation survivors growing up securely and safely in the United States and the experience of their family members suffering extreme poverty, hunger, mistreatment, torture, death is often too much for the memoirs, and their imagination fails. Another silence falls, this time upon the writers, because they have no words for the atrocities they encounter via photographs, letters, and records left by the Nazis. A common feature of the memoirs by American authors that I have read is that the author born in the US has, on the surface of things, led a relatively privileged and protected life. Underneath that sense of security and safety, however, is the felt sense of having lived, quote unquote, under the pall of the Holocaust, as Eleanor Sontag puts it. Second generation memoirist Rosenthal explains, as for the children and grandchildren of the Jews who escaped death at the hands of their persecutors, we did not experience the Holocaust. We are not survivors. We did not see our families murdered. We were never cold. We were never starved. We were never beaten. We grew up in comfort. And yet, what we do have, what sets us apart, is that we grew up with our parents and grandparents. We absorbed their trauma firsthand. Perhaps that is why, while these second generation memoirs included narratives of significant eventual success, the survivors themselves are nevertheless often described by their children as having suffered from untreated depression, anger, and anxiety, again, aspects of the family life that were kept a secret, not to be spoken about. Although there were important outreach and service organizations that helped survivors to financially make their way in their new countries, these kinds of psychological needs were often left untreated and unrecognized, and thus passed on to the children. A childhood survivor describes the situation. I soon realized that the profession of psychotherapy, at least in Canada, was ill-equipped to deal with the problems of child survivors of the Holocaust. Help was nowhere near. I found there was and still is a general sense of denial about the psychological and emotional condition of child survivors. Even child survivors themselves seemed unable to approach their own dilemma of post-Holocaust survival, its psychological implications on themselves and their children. Non-survivors writing about the Holocaust turned us into heroes and professional success stories, ignorant of the terrible memory and its continuing sadness in our souls. I found myself living in a world that acknowledged neither our suffering as children nor our existing traumatized post-Holocaust condition. Noted psychologist David Bedrick writes that as a therapist, he has learned that many Jews internalize this lack of recognition by ignoring or disavowing the connection between their personal suffering and their Jewish identity. As a result, Jews can suffer from various symptoms, both psychological and physical, which they believe are manifestations of their personal problems or pathologies, instead of thinking these symptoms are a result of unprocessed Jewish trauma related to the Holocaust. In fact, most Jews make no connection between their particular suffering and their Jewish identity. In short, they ignore their specific history and instead quarantine themselves off into a kind of inner ghetto, thinking something is wrong with them, a form of Jewish shame. Indeed, second-generation survivors, according to their memoirs, sometimes suffer from unexplained anxieties and depressions, signs of inherited and often unarticulated trauma that baffled them as children. Born in a displaced persons camp, Regina Rock, who uses a pseudonym to protect her mother and father's identities, describes a particularly oppressive and unstable emotional home life in which her sister accused her father of incest. Her mother is incapacitated by depression and her father by alcoholism, a life she is able to escape and heal from, although her sister is not so fortunate. Less shockingly, but still relevant, Sontag describes being gripped by fear and recurring nightmares that her family would be destroyed in a fire and that she would be unable to help them. In going public and breaking the silence about the hidden dark sides to stories of assimilation and success, these second-generation memoirs break the unspoken rule to suffer in silence and to not air one's dirty laundry, quote unquote. In other words, to protect the family's good name. In writing about psychological wounds and trauma, whether their own or their parents, these memoirs bravely break with tradition so that they can make sense of their own experience and so that their children and their readers can learn from the lessons these experiences have given them. Their motive, to my mind, is not to seek attention or exact revenge, but to find meaning and to break the chain of suffering. There is no easy way to avoid the past. We can only continue to tell our family stories, and in so doing, resist the narratives that work to dismiss and silence our history, and in those attempts, hope to heal. Thank you. So I can now take questions if you want to put them in the chat. So this is the first question, and unfortunately I can't see who is asking it, but it says, has your own exploration of this topic helped your family process the trauma? I think it has happened in different ways for every person in my family, and my way has been through writing because I was oriented that way. And I think other people might find other paths. But I think what has happened for all of us in some way is a return to a sense of Jewish identity that we didn't take on early in my life. And so I think that is one commonality throughout my immediate family, is that in some fashion or another, we have come to terms with being Jewish, which I think prior to that, we're not publicly Jewish, did not celebrate Jewish holidays, did not identify as Jewish. If it's not too personal, have you and your brother processed the trauma of the Holocaust differently? What role, if any, do you think gender might play in those differences? That's a great question. I think the reason that for me, I focused here on women, and I don't know how clear it is that in my family's situation, my father was violent and my mother was the victim of domestic abuse, very severe, and so were my brother and myself. So it has that gendered aspect of violence that most often are male perpetrators of violence within families. And so, obviously this was a secret that was hidden. It occurred throughout my childhood and we never spoke of it, and I never spoke publicly of it. And so when I read other stories of women coming to terms with that kind of history, identify strongly with it, I think my brother had to come to terms in his own way with that history and forge a different identity for himself, so that he wouldn't feel that he was somehow fated to repeat that history. Yeah. So question, the book None is Too Many. It seems that immigrating to Canada was extremely difficult. The US apparently was even worse. So, we're very grateful that Canada opened the doors. I think the US would have been impossible. But extremely difficult for Jews hoping to escape. How did your family manage to gain entry and in what year? So 1939, and I think prior to that, if I'm understanding the story correctly, my grandfather had been in Canada and had some business operations there, something he had some contacts. And so this is the handshake deal that he spoke about, that my cousin writes about, that he had entryway. But then when they arrived, it turned out that this was all kind of a sham, and there wasn't really anything from there. But it did allow him passage, and it did allow him to retain his life. Okay, Andrew, sure, go ahead. It says I can read and speak this if you want, so go ahead.
Okay, well, first of all, Daphne, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. And I just wanted to say how I really appreciated you were sharing the story. And, as a historian, sharing the truth that history and personal stories are messy. Mm-hmm. And it reminded me of something I just saw on PBS NewsHour, which was another English scholar, Elizabeth Summit, I think, who just wrote a new book talking about how her father was an American serviceman during World War II, and she's talking in her new book, Looking for the Good War, was talking about how we create a simplified, kind of mythology about, which makes it harder actually for the survivors. I'm sorry, in that case, it was like, the GIs, obviously for their children. And I think, I see this like in Irina Klepfit's work or in Art Spiegelman's work, that, there's maybe because of a little bit of a distance, or because of maybe a little bit edge in their writing, that they were able to deal with these kinds of things like abuse. And how does the trauma, I think it's a really great to hear that. I think by focusing on women's stories, that I really applaud your courage. And I was just trying to think that, because maybe one of the challenges is because we oftentimes write a lot of the literature is more towards children or young adults,
Mm-hmm.
Or even thinking about when the story of the Holocaust became public, there still was so much anti-Semitism in this country. Yeah. And I think a lot of people wanted more simplified stories of kind of like good and evil.
Sure.
So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you raised so many great questions, but this is one of the things when people ask me, my students sometimes ask, well, why is so many stories about the Holocaust? It's not the only genocide, and often it's because it's so clear a story of good versus evil. There's no possible way to argue that the Nazis had some good ideas there, and that the conflicts is confusing, and they're both sides had their arguments, right? In most wars and most conflicts, when we're teaching them, we have to sort of give each side its due. But when you look at the Holocaust, it's an easy good versus evil. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's so often used as sort of a backdrop, really, for film and literature, and sort of the way the Civil War can become a backdrop for the romance novel, right? You have an adventure story or something you want to tell, and you just put the Holocaust as a backdrop, because here are the good guys, here are the bad guys. But of course, what that does is it makes the stories of the good guys, they have to become heroes. And the survivors often, are characterized in ways that are complicated. I mean, there are a series of different types of portrayals of the survivors. Initially as sort of weak and meek and unable to fight for themselves. Later on, we see films that focus on resistance, such as Defiance, so that the portrayal of the survivor has emerged and changed, shifted a little bit over the years. But the idea of the survivor as a traumatized person who's passing on these horrible things to their children, that is really not a story anyone wants to hear. And so I think there is this sense of the memoirs having to work against this public image, this very strong story that everyone knows. They want a good person, at least one good innocent person. And then to find that this victim of the Shoah is not so innocent, is not necessarily more moral, can make the same mistakes, is capable of violence. That's very, very hard for people to accept, I think. So they're really sort of working against the grain. And I think this is, the second generation sort of had the responsibility to be more honest about what was happening. It's just too much for the first generation. They had to survive and take care of their families first. So it was left to us. Okay, let's see if I can see if there's another question here. So it says, this is a broad prompt, so take it in any direction you wish. But what have you been most surprised to learn or uncover in conducting your research on this topic? Well, initially, by far, how some of the stories were. I cannot tell you, it just was so surprising. And when I first started doing all this, I really thought it was just me and my family that were silent about this. I really thought I was completely isolated and alone. And I remember talking to people about this and saying, well, it's going to be hard to talk about silence. I don't know how you're going to write about being silent. There's nothing there. What are you going to write about? And so I really didn't know what I was doing. I felt like there wasn't enough material. And then as I read these memoirs over and over and over again, the silence of the first generation comes about over and over again. And so I felt like, okay, I'm onto something here. This isn't just me. This is something that I shared with many people. And that was really a huge, huge step forward in believing in the research and believing there was a story here to tell. It also really flies in the face of what most people expect about Jewish identity. I mean, most people are so surprised because they think of the Holocaust as a cornerstone, as sort of key to Jewish identity. So the idea that the actual survivors would never talk about it, that the children of the survivors have no knowledge of this history, that just flies in the face of what most Americans, and I think most American Jewish communities sort of assume about the Holocaust, that it is central to Jewish identity. So it really is an irony that those who are most affected by the Holocaust, it wasn't central to their identity. It was pushed aside. And even being Jewish was sometimes pushed aside. Okay, this is in Dutch, so I'm just going to read it because it's so fun. It says, Lieve Daphne, geen vraag, wel een reactie. So dear Daphne, this is not a question, but it is a reaction. Dank voor het delen van jouw verhaal en onderzoek. Thank you for sharing your story and your research. Ik ben het zusje van Alexander. I'm a sister of Alexander, and Alexander was a classmate of mine in Holland when my father went back to Holland. It's a whole other story to sort of find, I think, this Jewish community. Hij wees mij op jouw lezing. He told me about this presentation. Ook omdat ik nog volop in het proces ben van verwerken van mijn en ons familie trauma verwikkeld ben. So she herself is involved very much in the process of working through her families and her family trauma. Jouw verhaal helpt me erg om te begrijpen. Your story helps me very much to understand. Dank, liefs, Vanessa. Thank you. Liefs, yeah, how do you translate liefs? I don't know. I guess love, but this is a little bit different. Vanessa, from one to another. This is how we survive. So, yeah. Goed dat je het e-mail deed en veel succes. En ik ben hier voor je. Als je wilt schrijven of bellen, dan kunnen we dat zeker doen. So I really thought this question would come up, and I'm going to go ahead and read it out loud. So it says, I see parallels within this Sino, I think it is, Japanese and the atrocities suffered by the Chinese. And I've heard this from my friends as well when I talk about this. My mother had no desire to go back to China. She never talked about her war experiences with me. My uncle, who was with the US State Department, refused to buy anything Japanese like cars and TVs. So I do think that when I tell this story, it has resonances with other families and cultures and traditions. Now, of course, I can't myself make any of those connections without feeling like it's, another place, another time, someone else's story. But I do think that for every person who has suffered this kind of mass historical trauma, there is at heart the desire for something better, and at heart a desire for connection with other communities across that difference. So I love hearing those stories because they make me feel a little bit more part of a human experience. Question: the videos your brother captured of your father treasures, what other oral history projects has your family initiated? So that is a great question. You know, eventually my brother and I woke up to the reality that my parents are in their 80s and 90s and it's time. And so my brother recorded this with my little nephew next to him, which I find one of the best things about this video, because, you know, he's going like this with his beard, making fun of my father. And, you know, it's great to see the generations next to one another. And on my part, I did interview my mother. She had a stroke last year, so she wouldn't be able to do those interviews now. So I'm very glad that I managed to interview her before her stroke. Okay, I think, did I get all of the questions? Oh, okay. Was wondering before this is over if you can post a reading list. I can figure out how to do that. I have my works cited. I can definitely give you, but I have so many more sources. So actually, this is from Robert K. If you want to email me at desser@hawaii.edu, I'll give you a very extensive bibliography. And then you can just pick and choose from whatever you want. But I spent a good 5 years just reading about this. It says, my mother was a survivor who hid in Amsterdam. Wow. Allah and Frank, also German Jew. Okay, so we need to talk. So if you would, Robert, if you would email me at desser@hawaii.edu, I'll send you the most extensive bibliography I have, and maybe we can also set up a Zoom, and I'd really like to hear your story. It's another question. This is Sebastian Bertrand. I didn't even know he was here. Sebastian, oh my goodness. Do you have any suggestions of resources that could be put into place to help prevent future collective trauma? Right, that is the forward-looking question, and a really important question. And I have a few resources that I can send your way. So yes, but that the emphasis is an important one. Okay, great. Did I get all the questions? I think that's all I see in the chat. So thank you very much for your presence and for the time that you've spent here. And if you have any further questions, you know, feel free to contact me. I think my email is in the chat. It's very simple, desser@hawaii.edu. And I thank you very much for your time.